Dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats. Wznawiam sesję.
I resume the session. I'm opening this session, which was adjourned on the 17th of June 2010. The minutes of the meeting of the 17th of June 2010 and the text adopted therein are available for viewing. Are there any comments? I can't see any. The minutes have been adopted. I'd like to briefly tell you that this morning I have come back from a two-day official visit to Russia. This has been the first visit of the President of the European Parliament in Russia for 12 years. In Moscow, I met President Medvedev, Chair of the Duma Boris Gryzlov, Chair of the Council of the Federation Sergei Mironov, and Minister of Foreign Affairs and Energy Minister. We talked about the EU-Russia relations as part of the Partnership for Modernization, as well as about the negotiations of a new accord between the EU and the Russian Federation. Other issues have also been tackled, including the issue of human rights. I also met representatives of civil society organizations, including Memorial, the winner of the Sakharov Prize in 2009. During my stay in Moscow, the gas dispute between Belarus and Russia has escalated. I told the Russian authorities how concerned we were with the situation, and I called upon the parties of the conflict to meet their contractual obligations regarding gas deliveries to the EU. I also noted that there should be relevant clauses in relevant contracts between Belarus and Russia which would guarantee gas supplies to the EU. The guarantee of supplies is the most important thing for us. Also, the Council and the Commission are looking into the matter. Perhaps representatives of both situations might give us an update on the situation while this session is in progress. At any rate, the situation is changing. It's work in progress. Every hour brings us new information regarding the dispute. Colleagues, for your information, members of the delegation of the Indonesian Parliament have taken seats in the official guests gallery. I'd especially like to welcome especially His Excellency Kemal Aziz Tambolel. The Indonesian delegation is hosted on the occasion of the subsequent meeting of the Interparliamentary Assembly of the EU and Indonesia. As you know, it is a developing society whose economy is playing an important part in worldwide, especially in the ASEAN Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This has been the first country with which the EU signed a partnership and cooperation agreement back in 2009. It is with great pleasure that I welcome representatives of the Indonesian Parliament among us. Next item of information. Mr. Mike Natras has left the ranks of the Europe of Freedom and Democracy, EFD, and that from the 23rd of June 2010 he will be with the non-attached members. The competent authorities of the Netherlands told me that Luis Bontes has been replaced by Mr. Lucas Hartong, and that Ms. Janine Hennis Plachert has been replaced by Mr. Jan Mulder, effective from the 22nd of June 2010, i.e. since yesterday. I welcome the two new colleagues among us.
Bardzo proszę. Dziękuję.
Thank you. Under Article 3, Para 2 of the European Parliament's staff regulations, until their mandates have been verified, as well as certificates of potential disputes will have been issued. Mr. Lucas and Müller will take part in the Parliament sitting and will enjoy all rights, provided they will have declared by that time that they don't fulfill any other functions that might conflict with the function of an MEP. The Secretariat of the non-affiliated MEPs has given me motions concerning the following nominations to the committees and interparliamentary assemblies. I will list the list of nominations because it's important format. For the Budget Committee, Lucas Hartong to replace Daniel van der Stoep. Civil Freedoms, Justice and Internal Affairs Committee, Daniel van der Stoep has been nominated. Special Committee for Political Challenges and Budgetary Resources for a Sustainable EU Beyond 2013, Lucas Hartong has replaced Daniel van der Stoep. Delegations for relations with the Legislative Palestinian Council, Daniel van der Stoep has been nominated. Delegation for relations with the United States, Lawrence Stassen has replaced Daniel van der Stoep. Delegation for relations with the Korean Peninsula, Lucas Hartong has replaced Lawrence Stassen. Are there any comments regarding these nominations? I can't see any. The nominations have been approved. Written declaration 29/2010 presented by MEPs Tiziano Motti and Anna Zaborska concerning the creation of the European Rapid Alert System against pedophiles and people who harassers has been signed. Therefore, I'd like to congratulate that to the colleagues. Therefore, and under Article 1 to 3 of the regulations, the declarations will be published in the text published during this meeting with the names of signatories in the minutes of the meeting. The next item on our agenda are European Council and Council declarations, conclusions of the European Council, which took place on the 17th of June 2010. I'd like to welcome among us the President of the European Council and the President of the European Commission. Gentlemen, thank you for coming. We will move into the discussion shortly. Before we do that, we'll start with the address by Mr. Herman Van Rompuy, President of the European Council. The floor is yours.
Mr. President of the European Parliament, Mr. President of the European Commission, dear colleagues, this was the first meeting of the European Council since I became its President that was not dominated by an immediate urgency. It was a normal meeting and the decisions we took were of considerable significance, not least in terms of dealing with the ongoing economic situation and looking beyond the crisis at how we can improve Europe's long-term economic performance. We recently showed a strong political determination in safeguarding the stability of the euro. I was happy to note at this meeting a similar resolve to enhance our long-term economic strength through a new European strategy for jobs and growth, including the Europe 2020 strategy. Building on the work of the Commission and of the sectoral councils, we endorsed the 5 headline targets with which you are now familiar and which we consider to be crucial for increasing Europe's economic growth rate. Itself essential if we are to maintain our European way of life with an ageing population and if we want to remain a world player. Now, I know that some in this House and elsewhere have expressed misgivings and asked whether the Europe 2020 strategy can produce better results than the previous Lisbon strategy, generally held to have been insufficient. My firm belief is that it can. We have deliberately chosen to focus on a smaller number of targets rather than the plethora of targets that got lost in the Lisbon strategy. They are vital targets and integrate the social, environmental and educational dimensions that your Parliament has rightly insisted on. We will focus relentlessly on those targets with ongoing work and annual reviews. There will be national breakdowns of targets and not just Europe-wide aggregates, thereby providing realistic yardsticks to measure national performances. Above all, I have sought to achieve a sense of ownership of the process by our Member States so that they do not consider this to be something adopted in Brussels, which they subsequently ignore, but consider it to be an inherent part of their own economic strategy. I count on the European Parliament to keep up the pressure for implementing the EU 2020 strategy. It has to be a vital part of how we assess the state of our Union. I was pleased that when you, President, addressed the heads of state and of government at the start of the last week's meeting of the European Council, you draw attention to this Parliament's support for the Europe 2020 strategy. That was very welcome. At the same time, I know that there are some in this chamber and elsewhere who have expressed concerns about the method being used to implement the strategy. Is it, as some have claimed, too much of an intergovernmental working method? I would simply point out that improving Europe's economic performance requires the use of a range of instruments, some of them a European competence and others a national competence. At the European level, we can and do adopt common legislation for our common market on the regulation of financial services, on competition policy, on trade, on consumer protection and on other matters. We can also make use of the EU budget, in particular the structural funds and the research programmes. In all this, the role of the Commission is pivotal. But key aspects of our economic performance remain essentially a national competence, not least education. If we are to be successful, we need to mobilise all levels of government in a common endeavour. According to the treaty, and I quote Article 121, Member States shall regard their economic policies as a matter of common concern and shall coordinate them within the Council. This coordination is to be based on European Council's conclusions and involves all the institutions with an input from both the Commission and the Parliament. And we are currently increasing the scope of this coordination, just as we are increasing the scope of what we do through EU legislation, such as on banking legislation. Both coordination of national policies and common action at EU level are required. The task of the European Council, bringing together as it does both the leaders of the national governments and the President of the Commission, is to determine the guidelines and political direction of both these elements. Those who are seeking to pit the Commission and Member States against each other do the Union a disservice. I might add that it is also somewhat facile to equate the European Council with simple intergovernmentalism. It is now an EU institution. It operates within the framework of the carefully balanced architecture of the Union as a whole, described in the treaties. It includes among its members the President of the Commission. It now has, as its own president, someone chosen to work in the interest of the Union as a whole and who is not simultaneously representing a national government. In any case, we should not assume that heads of national governments are not capable of perceiving the wider common interest, or that they are unaware of the fact that their own national interest is indeed to have a well-functioning Union. Coming back to our meeting of last week, the European Council also took a decision which, in my opinion, is of equal importance of the Europe 2020 strategy. This was the decision to establish a scorecard and a system of surveillance to better assess competitiveness, developments and imbalances, so that we can detect unsustainable or dangerous trends at an earlier stage. Such imbalances have not been focused on in the past, partly because they were not identified in the treaty as one of the Maastricht criteria. Yet they are of vital importance. Indeed, the current situation facing a number of our member states can be traced back to these imbalances. The euro was a victim of its own success. We forgot that the common currency needs convergence and reforms. Errors are made at all levels of governments over the last 10 years. Let's be honest, it is a collective responsibility. Regarding the financial sector, our priority is to have a solid and healthy banking system. We have called upon the European Parliament and the ECOFIN Council to rapidly adopt the legislative proposals on financial supervision to ensure that the European Systemic Risk Board and the 3 supervisory authorities can begin working from the beginning of next year. Your contribution of the Parliament is vital, and your responsibility is great in this matter. We agreed also that stress tests of the banks would be published at the latest in the second half of July. We asked the Commission to quickly make proposals on naked short selling and credit default swaps. The European Council agreed that Member States should introduce a system of levies and taxes on financial institutions, and we agreed to explore and to develop with our G20 partners the possibility of introducing a global financial transaction tax. Indeed, we agreed a common position on a number of other items that will be dealt with at the G20 Toronto Summit, where Mr. Barroso and myself will have the honour of representing the Union. We also reconfirmed the European Union's position on achieving the Millennium Development Goals, in particular our development aid targets by 2015, despite the economic crisis, and we also reaffirmed our willingness to progress further on climate change. We agreed, subject to certain conditions, to commence the accession negotiations for Iceland to join the European Union and welcomed Estonia's application to join the Eurozone, both a sign of confidence in the future of our Union. We adopted a declaration on Iran, which underlined our deep concerns about its nuclear programme and asked the Foreign Affairs Council to adopt at its next meeting measures to implement the UN Security Council sanctions and to accompany them with further measures. In doing so, we proved that the Union can have a common position on one of the most delicate issues in world politics today. The second part of the meeting focused on the issue of economic governance and better coordination of economic policy. I reported back on the work undertaken so far by the task force that the European Council asked me to chair. Already, a high degree of convergence is emerging, and I intend to complete the work of this task force by October at the latest. I will be meeting your delegation both before and after the summer break in order to ensure the Parliament's contribution is fully integrated into our work. The European Council welcomed my progress report and agreed on a first set of orientations. It approved the provisional conclusions on a stricter supervision of the budgets and competitiveness. There is agreement that we need to strengthen both the preventive and the corrective arms of the Stability and Growth Pact, the system of sanctions foreseen in the pact needs to be reviewed so as to have a coherent and progressive system. There was agreement on the European Commission's idea of European semester, whereby Member States will present their stability and convergence programmes already in the spring of each year, thereby enabling a common review of the underlying assumptions and trends affecting national budgets for the coming years, of course taking account of national budgetary procedures. On this point, I should emphasise that it was never suggested that finance ministers should have to submit their national budget to the Commission for approval prior to submitting it to their national parliaments. No one would endorse such an infringement of parliamentary competences. The work of the task force is not finished. Other ideas from the Commission, of course, from the Central Bank, from your Parliament and from Member States, from whom we have had nearly a dozen written contributions, are still to be discussed. Some ideas might require treaty change, but as that is a more lengthy and cumbersome procedure, we will give priority to those proposals that can be enacted more speedily and more easily. There anyway seems to be an emerging consensus that we do not need to create new institutions for our economic governance, but to make better use of those that we already have. And while specific decisions will sometimes be necessary at the level of the Eurozone countries, and when required I will convene Eurozone summits as I did already twice, it is at the level of the whole of our Union that the main aspects of our economic governance must be decided. Whether we are in the Eurozone or not, we are economically interdependent and share the common ownership of the world's largest market. That is the level at which the bulk of European decisions must be taken through the institutional structures and procedures of our Union. In this context, in accordance with the Treaty, the European Council intends to fulfil its role of setting political directions and priorities for the Union, including economic strategy and governance. Dear colleagues, the economic challenges facing Europe remain immense. We were very close to the edge of the precipice just a few weeks ago, and we have not yet reached safety. We were right to provide a fiscal stimulus at the depth of the recession, but we must be careful not to reach a situation where fiscal deficits and accumulated level of debt become unsustainable and begin to be themselves a threat to our economic recovery. The measures taken by the Member States to reduce their deficit will not have a profound deflationary effect for the Union as a whole, if they restore confidence in the economy, thereby stimulating both consumption and investment. On the other hand, failure to correct unsustainable deficits would ultimately lead to a fatal loss of credibility and confidence with lasting economic damage. The measures taken are differentiated according to the varied situations of each Member State, and they are gradual. Indeed, rather than the absolute level, it is the direction and its sustainability that are important. Provided we persevere, I have every confidence that Europe will turn the corner. Dear colleagues, I consider this meeting of the European Council to have been a further important step in combating the crisis, which started as a financial crisis and became an economic, budgetary and nearly a monetary crisis. We are drawing the lessons of all this and correcting the course step by step. I am confident that we will succeed. Thank you.
Thank you to the President of the European Council. On behalf of the European Commission, the floor is over to José Manuel Barroso. President.
President of the European Parliament, President of the European Council, President of the Council, honourable members, dear colleagues. Only a week ago, we met in Strasbourg to prepare for the June European Council and the G20 summit in Toronto. In front of this House, I said that in face of the current economic problems, growth is the answer. That this growth had to be smart, sustainable, inclusive. That it must build on fiscal consolidation and structural reforms. And that for this to happen, we need to advance on several fronts at once, namely by adopting the Europe 2020 strategy, by rapidly concluding remaining work in financial markets regulation and supervision, by coming forward with ambitious measures to reinforce our economic governance in Europe, and finally by entering the G20 meeting in Toronto with a strong and united European Union position. I am glad to say that exactly this has been the path taken by the European Council last week, and that happened largely on the basis of proposals put forward by the Commission. This European Council reached exceptionally substantive conclusions, as we took decisions on strategic orientations which point to the future and offer a vision. The result of last European Council went beyond simply adding up national approaches. It delivered a truly European perspective in three areas in particular: economic governance, financial regulation supervision, and, of course, also in everything that has to do with our future European strategy for growth and jobs, Europe 2020. First, economic governance. Though this is still work in progress, the outline of what is needed is now clear. You note that the Commission has set some ideas on its communication of the 12th of May, a European semester to bring together surveillance of structural and fiscal policies, making the treaty provisions on debt work effectively, more creative use of carrots and sticks to help the Stability and Growth Pact to head off future problems and correct them when they arise, ensuring that national budgetary frameworks are set up in the right way to respect treaty obligations, and broadening economic surveillance to tackle macroeconomic imbalances and competitiveness problems in the internal market, so as to cover the full range of key issues and not just look at the budgetary dimension. We now have a European consensus that this is the way forward. The next steps are for the task force, chaired by the President of the European Council, to dip this consensus and translate it into detailed action. With this in mind, the Commission will next week put on the table some ideas about concrete further action, and we are already working on detailed proposals. We will have these on the table by the end of September, because I believe here time is also extremely important. The second key area where we reached important agreement was financial services. We all know that the job here is not complete, and we all know how important it is to have the right regulatory basis for sound, responsible financial services in place, to give confidence that we have the bulwarks in place against future pressures. Here, of course, the role of this Parliament is essential. As I did with heads of state and government last week in the European Council, I would likewise appeal to you to make every effort to ensure that the proposals on financial supervisions are adopted before the summer break, so that the new arrangements can be in place for next year. The same urgency is there for alternative investment fund managers and capital requirements. I was delighted that the European Council took up the target in our 2 June communication to have the next phase of financial services proposals agreed by the end of 2011. Issuing these proposals will be a major focus of the Commission's work this autumn, and I am sure that this Parliament will be ready to give the speedy attention needed to these very important initiatives. I also believed that it was particularly important for the European Council to agree on proposals for an effective and coherent approach on the stress testing of banks. Making the results public on a bank-by-bank basis is the right way to use transparency to fuel confidence and prevent the unfounded speculation which distorts the market. We will know exactly what problems still exist and exactly how they will be tackled. And as I said in the European Council, the Commission will stand ready to make whatever examination may be needed under our state aid rules in case interventions are necessary. Another central strand of our action, and I think probably one of the most important conclusions of this European Council, was of course Europe 2020. This was now accepted by the European Council as the European Union strategy for economic growth for the long term, in the sustainable and inclusive way we proposed just a few months ago, and to which this House has given substantial input. I am reassured that it has been possible for this approach to be agreed so quickly, and in particular that we have been able to agree the 5 headline targets, including on education and fighting poverty. I would like to underline this point because, as you know, it was not evident at the beginning that the Member States would agree also to share their action in terms of what are mainly national competences, but that we can put together in a coordinated manner at European level. With this, the 27 heads of state and government have made far-reaching commitments. There should be full apprehension of the fact that leading a European Union member state is also leading one part of the European Union, and that there should be no contradiction between these important tasks of leadership. The strong and positive political impetus put by this Parliament was extremely helpful in reaching this positive result, and I want to thank you once again. And I also want to thank the President of the Parliament, because in the first part of the work of the European Council he made it clear with strong European conviction how important it was to reach agreement on those matters. Let me thank this House for the very substantial input which you are giving to the strategy, and which of course I hope we will continue to give in the future, because as you know, work is far from complete. We still have to define some of the most important and critical issues regarding the implementation of this strategy. In fact, we now face the hard work of putting the strategy to work, engaging people at all levels of society and in all parts of the economy. That is why I have welcomed since the beginning the idea of the ownership of the strategy also by our member states. It could not, it should not be seen only as a strategy from Brussels or from Strasbourg. It is important that it is seen as a true strategy that mobilises our society. The Commission will be coming forward with the flagship initiatives to drive the European dimension of the strategy and working closely with Member States to develop the national reform programmes. The success of the strategy will also rely heavily on the work of this Parliament in your own constituencies, with civil society, with national parliament colleagues, but I would also like to say with the social partners, with society at large. This will be a real common effort for the coming months and years. This comprehensive economic approach gives us the strongest of platforms for the G20 meeting this week, a clear and united position which can offer the kind of leadership we have been able to offer to the G20 since 2008. In a joint letter signed by Herman Van Rompuy and myself, we have highlighted to all our G20 colleagues what are the priorities, what is the programme of the European Union in this meeting. It's the first time, for the first time, the European Union, apart from its member states, puts together a position regarding what are our priorities for global action, and I think this should be welcome. We have action underway and we have a clear timetable for the future. That is the challenge we can take to partners worldwide. Some of the matters are extremely controversial in some of our members, of our colleagues of the G20, for instance the issue of the bank levy and the financial transaction tax. But it was in fact important that at European level we have reached a consensus on those matters. In conclusion, the success of last week's European Council shows how the European Union is most effective when it concentrates on the priorities. When we face a new challenge, we should resist the temptation to rush to set up new mechanisms, new structures, those kind of institutional debates that never end. We should rather have confidence in the institutions we have, give them, of course, our support, and their ability, and have confidence in their ability to deliver in just the way we saw last week. Honourable members, before concluding, let me just congratulate the Parliament the Council and the High Representative for the successful outcome of the negotiations on the External Action Service. The Commission very much welcomes an agreement which clearly foresees a service which is part of the Community system and that largely follows the proposals that Cathy Ashton has put forward in agreement with the Commission, working alongside the institutions and with the same rules of accountability as any other part of the European public service. And I would like also to tell you that the Commission will work hard with this House and the other institutions to ensure that the European External Action Service will be up and running as soon as possible. This was one of the important innovations of the Lisbon Treaty. We have now to make it a reality. The European Parliament can count on the Commission to defend the Community method as being the best way to deliver the results our citizens expect to see. I believe this European Council was indeed a very important progress for our European project. Thank you for your attention.
Dziękuję.
Thank you very much.
Dziękuję, panie przewodniczący.
Thank you very much, President, for your speech. Now, on behalf of different parties, on behalf of EPP, Mrs. Wortmann-Kool.
Ja, dank u wel.
Thank you, President.
De EVP-fractie is blij dat...
The EPP group welcomes the fact that under your presidency, the Council has taken significant steps forward towards improving economic governance in Europe with a common approach in the G20, because the crisis requires us finally to create a more solid foundation for the continued existence of the euro. The budgets must be tackled to restore confidence in the financial markets and amongst our citizens. Parliament supports a strengthening of the preventive arm of the Growth and Stability Pact. We have to bring in penalties, but everything will depend on how the task force puts these things into practice. The intergovernmental method will not help us out of the crisis. As far as we're concerned, we need a community governance approach. No new institutions, rather a strong role for the Commission. Mr. Barroso, it's positive that you're going to be coming forward with more detailed proposals in the coming months. Last week you told Parliament that the Commission is the economic government of Europe. You were applauded on that in the plenary, but that implies that you must make an ambitious use of your institutional right to come forward with initiatives. Looking at competitiveness in the 27 member states, that is what we want to achieve in the 2020 strategy, with SMEs as the driving force of our economy. I'm still concerned about how you can put member states on the spot regarding their commitments. That's crucial to success. Our group calls on you to come forward with more specific proposals on that in the task force, because unless that is successfully addressed, we are still going to find ourselves ending up with a sort of unsuccessful Lisbon strategy too. And that's bad news for our citizens, their jobs and economic growth. President, you called upon us to decide quickly on the financial supervision package, but you know that the problem is not here in Parliament. The problem lies in the Council, because the Council is still not prepared to put the Larosière report into any concrete legislation. There's been progress under the Spanish presidency, but you must appeal to your colleagues in the Council to show the same sort of preparedness that Parliament has demonstrated, and that's vital if we're going to meet the January deadline. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Mrs. Ulvskog for the Socialists.
Thank you very much indeed, President. 14,000 barrels of oil per day are being released into the Gulf of Mexico. And in fact, what we're seeing is devastation taking place. But in the north of Europe, there are people who are seeing oil being brought to our part of the world via the Gulf Stream. And as you know, we are incredibly vulnerable, and nobody lives on their own island within the global context, because everything is interwoven, everything is interlinked, which is why we need to look at swapping to renewable energy, and not just that, but looking ahead to an entirely different kind of society. And very often we get broad majorities when we adopt resolutions, but in fact far too little is being done. So we shouldn't lose our focus on these issues because of the economic crisis. We won't succeed in resolving the problems linked to the economic crisis unless we recognise our vulnerability environmentally. Now, vulnerability is also true of the financial markets, because they react, and that's been the case over decades. So many people who are sitting in the various political groups here thought that it was fine, that it was good that the market enjoys such power. But now, at long last, we ought to take decisions which will mean that we'll have a regulation of the financial markets. That is of enormous importance. And if you look at what's been going on in a lot of the member states, where we've been talking about untrammeled market forces which have given rise to huge problems, and then the vulnerability issue comes back when we're looking at how we're going to put this market regulation in place. Draconian, swinging cuts in public finances, which mean that we're putting recovery at risk because of the economic crisis. The crisis can become a deep-rooted recession. And that's certainly something which member states run a risk of seeing. So here what we're seeing is a risk of damage being done to what we're trying to salvage. Now, I listened very closely to what Mr. Van Rompuy said. I think that what he said was very good. But there's an awful lot of architecture and very little by way of human beings in sight here. So here we are talking about fighting for the environment and fighting for our financial markets, but here we're also having to contend with massive employment rates, and the ranks of the unemployed are continuing to swell. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your words. Now for the Liberals, Mr. Verhofstadt.
Mr. President, let me first say that it is an evidence that the member states of the Union have to play an important role, a vital role, I should say, in the economic strategy of the Union and of the Eurozone in the next years. But the most important question is another. The most important question today is who will do the control and who shall do the sanctioning if some of the member states are not fulfilling the conditions. That is the key question. Will the control be in the hands of the member states themselves, of the Council, and will the member states sanctioning themselves, or will it be an independent institution, a communitarian institution of the European Union? That is the key question of today. And I have to tell you, I don't think that there is anybody here in this House who believes that the member states shall sanction themselves. They didn't do it in the past. Why should they do it in the future, dear colleagues? And let me give you some examples. In the Lisbon Treaty failed because there was no system of an independent institution controlling the member states on applying this Lisbon strategy. And the same happens in the Growth and Stability Pact. What happens in the Growth and Stability Pact? When it is small countries who are not fulfilling the conditions, then we live a Greek tragedy. And when it are big countries who are not fulfilling the conditions, like Germany did and France did, they adopt simply the Stability Pact and the Growth Pact. So it are not the member states who can do the job. It is an independent communitarian institution who have to do it. We are convinced of that. We have two resolutions that have to be adopted, mostly unanimously. And a few days ago, I think it was 2 days ago, the President of the European Central Bank, Mr. Trichet, said exactly the same, gave exactly the same analysis here in this Parliament. Well, European Parliament, European Commission, the President of the European Central Bank, we think that it is to the European Central Bank, to the European Commission. Trichet even proposed another institution. I don't think that we need new institutions for that, but in any way, it is based on the communitarian method that the European institution has to fulfill that role. And that doesn't mean that the member states don't play a role. No, they have to implement this whole strategy in daily politics, in the daily strategies that they develop in their own countries. And that is what we need, President. We need that in the Growth and Stability Pact, we need that in the Euro 2020 strategy, and we need that also in the new competitiveness strategy that we shall develop in the next months. My second point, Mr. President, is about the financial supervision. What is the problem here? The problem is that the European leaders shall go to the G20 and they cannot announce an agreement on the financial supervision. And the reason is very simple. The reason is that the ministers of finance of the European Union, the ECOFIN, in December came back on the good proposals of the Commission and based on the report of de Larosière. There is the problem. It is not here that the message has to be given. We have to give the message to the ministers of finance. They have to come back on their proposals and go in the direction of the Commission. The proposals of the Commission and de Larosière are based on a European supervision authority for the banks. That's the proposal mainly. And what the Ministers of Finance did in the ECOFIN in December last year was simply a little bit of coordination between national supervisors. National supervisors that didn't work in the financial crisis. There was no one national supervisor who alarmed the politicians at the moment of the financial crisis. And now they are explaining that's a good system, that we have simply to coordinate themselves. So what we need is that from the Council, from the European Council, there is pressure now on the Member States, on themselves, I should say, to go in the direction of a European supervision authority based on the proposals of de Larosière, President. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. President. On behalf of Group of Greens European Parliament, Co-President, Madam Rebecca Harms. The floor is yours.
Herr Präsident.
President, ladies and gentlemen, President of the Council. Let me just say that I was amazed. People talking how normal the last week's summit was. I think we're just continuing the false methodology of last week thereby. Let us not deceive ourselves that we've got to normality in European cooperation. If a summit is limited to 6 hours, so that nothing is said off script or falsely which would lead the euro further to fall, well, I mean, what's that? That's what the Council is doing, and it's not really your task now to help us to be continued in deception, continue in deception. I think we've got a clear enough vision. You don't need to try and pretend to us. We've heard that European economic governance is not doing too well, and I think in certain areas you can actually recognize that. I'd agree with that. The de Larosière report was mentioned to Mr. Barroso and Mr. Van Rompuy. What's your feeling? After a year's worth of discussion, now we agree on monitoring and supervision. But the Council just says no. We can't give the monitoring body a role of intervening. If something needs to be done, it's left to the Member States. That's absurd. So if at European level to give you support, we can expect more of you, I would have thought. Now, we in the European Parliament would like to get some sort of settlement or regulation on dangerous products, toxic products on the financial market, or at least a temporary stopping of trade in such products. Hedge funds, tax havens, management pay, all these things have to be looked at. and the dangerous levels of bonuses which are paid. And when we have a trialogue on all areas of finance and financial monitoring, well, at the end of the day, the Council or the Commission sort of digs its heels in and says no. I mean, we have been supporting you. I think it's right that it's important that Parliament should put its weight behind a méthode communautaire, community method. But, I mean, again, on the financial transactions tax, let's hope it gets through G20. I'd like to believe that. I really wait agog to see what comes out of Toronto. So, if you're there, make sure, Mr. Barroso, that you or your commissioner make sure that a unified European position gets through. We've always heard this, Mr. Juncker and other people in the summits. Make sure that you prepare this, that it is brought in, the introduction of a financial transaction tax in the European area, and that's something which you can put forward as a basis. Otherwise, you have used another summit just to really lead the European public, which is expecting more out of summits, down the garden path. Now, G20, sorry, 2020, if you look at Greece or Spain and some sort of common strategy to give a general pointer or policy of what we should do to get sustainable development and growth, well, that would be wonderful. Could we do that? But what have we got? We've got basically nice-sounding words, as in Lisbon strategy, sustainable development. You can say that as many times as you like. You can't say it too many times. It sounds good. And Lisbon strategy, there are all sorts of instruments and money which should be made available, but they're not. And for myself, as a Green politician, I still feel there's no persuasive argument that we're looking at resource efficiency, energy efficiency, ambitious climate protection. These are things which can be a motor for growth. In Germany at the moment, everybody's over the moon about the recovery in the automobile industry, because the Chinese are buying the sort of behemoths, the gas guzzlers. I mean, and that against the oil disaster which we can see happening. And Cancun failed as well. So Europe, so far, hasn't really understood what sustainable development really means. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much. Now Mr. KIRKHOPE for Conservative Group.
Presidents, the European Council rightly focused on the reform of Europe, something which my group is dedicated to. But I first want to say something about Iran. Iran, President, ought rightfully to be one of the most respected powers in the Middle East. It has a long history and a talented and innovative people, and we would much like to be able to work with Iran in tackling some of the global issues which are most pressing at this time. Recently I met with Iranian representatives who suggested what some of these issues might be. But sadly, President, Iran is in the hands of those who seem to care little about the aspirations of their own peoples or the concerns of their neighbours in the Gulf. It has recklessly pursued a nuclear energy program that has rightly provoked suspicion and alarm. If it were to develop nuclear energy in an open and transparent manner, no one should question its rights to do so. But by trying to develop these nuclear capabilities in secret, there can be little doubt that their motives and ambitions are a danger. So we welcome the steps the leaders of the European Union have taken to increase pressure on them to cooperate with the global community. If not, measures to restrict trade, banking, transport and the oil and gas industry will sadly have to be taken. We also welcome the agreement on Europe 2020, which we hope will merit its description as a centrepiece initiative of the Commission. There is still much work to be done in practice, and we do not yet agree with every detail, but if words can be turned into action, this will be a positive development for the European Union. Single market to be relaunched and extended. Trade, both within the EU and beyond, must be encouraged and facilitated. Unnecessary and bureaucratic barriers must be swept away. The burdens on our businesses and entrepreneurs must be reduced. Heavy-handed regulation must be replaced by smart regulation, or indeed simply less regulation. For the sake of both the euro and the economic future of all members of the European Union, budget deficits in all our countries, of course, have to be reduced. In the United Kingdom, we've now joined others who are taking these painful but necessary steps. Our emergency budget yesterday was dramatic, but, as the Chancellor Osborne said, unavoidable. Only by reducing the weight of public debt and securing long-term low interest rates will the private sector be able to invest and expand, creating jobs and generating growth. And it is the private sector, Presidents, which can best restore that growth and prosperity. We welcome the fact the European Council focused on immediate practical steps to support the euro. My own country is not, of course, a member of the Eurozone and will not join, but we have every reason to want it to be successful. But the ECR believes the measures necessary to improve the governance of the euro do not require further centralisation, and we would oppose measures to shift more power from the member states to Brussels. Nor could we support steps that would force non-Eurozone members to support financially the Eurozone, as it is, of course, primarily the responsibility of Eurozone members to support their system. But we stand ready to support initiatives which respect the treaty obligations of our respective member states. President, we live in an increasingly competitive era. The period of the economic preeminence of Europe and the United States is clearly drawing to a close. Our system of free market economics, liberal democracy and social protection for the most vulnerable faces challenges from others who espouse a more authoritarian brand of capitalism. We therefore urgently need reform to ensure we can continue to enjoy and develop our free form of life. Trying to escape this need by blindly clinging to a status quo would certainly end in our ruin.
Thank you very much for your words. And now, Mr. Bisky for GUE.
Thank you, President. The results of the Council meeting on Thursday of last week have to be measured against the global challenges that face us. If you look at the crisis on the European financial markets from May, we need to make sure that we're taking a step in the right direction and trying to overcome those problems. So we need to look at what we can do about the malfunctioning of the system as far as the financial markets are concerned. The Council is saying that the banks should be involved in paying the costs. Now, I can certainly welcome that, but there's only one thing that's lacking: my faith in this decision. Because first of all, we're talking about a bank tax where there isn't unanimous agreement within the EU about this. And if we're talking about implementing this decision, it really doesn't seem to be very realistic. Secondly, if we're talking about the introduction of a general financial transaction tax, I doubt that we can reassure financial actors or encourage them to refrain from speculation. So we need to realize that more stringent measures to be adopted against those who allow for too big a deficit to ensue might throttle an upturn, and it would actually mean that those who are already weakest financially would have to tighten their belts even further, and that would lead to a shrinkage of the state sector. I mean, that would be pre-programmed as the result. And we have to look at the financeability of the Europe 2020 programme, and that would be called into question. Fourthly, we have to look at an EU-wide market transaction tax, Eurobonds, eco-taxes, increasing the tax rates on large incomes. All of these things are not being adopted, which I find quite striking. Fifthly, we need to look at the democratic foundations of our society. Here, the EU is making a contribution when it comes to increasing pensionable age and making cuts in public services. So this means that once again the number of people living in poverty is increasing.
Thank you very much. Now for Europe of Freedom and Democracy, Mr. Farage.
Well, thank you, Mr. Van Rompuy, for your speech. I think it gave us a great insight as to why so much is failing inside the European Union today. You said the summit had happened, that the euro crisis had gone away, that we'd stepped back from the edge of the precipice, and then you gave us the gem, the quote of the day. You said that the euro had been a victim of its own success. Well, at least that'll bring a smile to the faces of millions of people tonight when they see the news. You must be indeed a modern-day Walter Mitty, a dreamer. You have been warned from the start that there were several countries that would not fit into the eurozone. You knew they cheated and lied and they bent the rules, and yet you carried on with this political project. Like Icarus, heading towards the danger despite the fact that you'd been warned that things wouldn't work. And I really was amazed last week when you admitted to me face to face that there is no plan B. There is no contingency plan to help countries like Greece and Spain and Portugal, which at some point will have to leave this currency. There is no plan to help them refloat their own national currencies. Just how much do these countries have to suffer in the pursuit of this euro dream? Just how much unemployment does there have to be? What level of civil disorder is acceptable to hold together a currency that simply cannot work? And I wonder for how much longer will the Germans go on paying the enormous bill? The extraordinary thing is that you and everybody in this room thinks you're doing this to be good Europeans. And I would put it to you that this place has nothing to do with Europe at all, that there is no such thing as a European identity. Indeed, the strength of Europe is its diversity of language, of culture and of states. And ironically, it is us, the EU sceptics, who will turn out to be the good Europeans.
Thank you. The floor is now over to Mr. Madlener. The floor is yours.
Dank u wel, voorzitter.
Thank you, President. I would like to start by saying how glad I am to see the outcome of the elections in the Netherlands, because my party, the Party of Freedom, has gone up from 9 to 23 seats, 24 even. This shows that the Dutch want less immigration, more security, and above all, we want less Europe. Europe's internal market is a wonderful way of pumping money to weaker countries. That's got to stop. So, Messrs. Van Rompuy, Barroso, you see, we don't need this. We're just pumping money away. You should have taken action years ago when Greece came along with false figures. You turned a blind eye to this for years, and you let your policy drift off course. And that's what you're still doing, President. Look at the list of countries knocking on the door now to join: Albania, Kosovo, Bosnia, Turkey. And you're talking here about Iceland, a bankrupt country, a country that wants to carry on authorising whaling, and a country which, according to preliminary conclusions, actually deceived the Dutch Central Bank, like what Greece did. And you refuse to take action. And you're doing the same here. You're saying to Iceland, come on in, you can carry on whaling, and you can fiddle the figures, because we want you on board. So you're turning a blind eye to all this slippage, and you can see how our citizens are reacting.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Estive a ouvir o senhor deputado com toda a atenção.
I listened very carefully to the honourable member, and saying that this parliament is not a parliament, but a pseudo-parliament. I think that was alleged. So I'd like to know, what are we doing? And why do the taxpayers pay your salary?
Voorzitter, daar kan ik heel helder over zijn. Wat wij...
I can be very clear about this, President. What we're doing is fighting people like you. We want European citizens to hear the truth about the way this Parliament is wasting money and the way you're constantly trying to enlarge the Union. That's why we made this great progress in the elections, and we'll have even more seats next time around.
Now the floor is over to the President of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy. The floor is yours.
Chers collègues, Monsieur le Président.
Colleagues, President. Well, I have no problem with certain types of criticism, but I do have a problem with a sort of a general approach, and I'll explain that. When I was here, beginning of March, actually in February I think, when we talked about the discussions of the first European Informal Council then, there were very strong doubts as to whether for Greece we'd be able to come up with a financial support plan and whether Greece would be able to take the necessary measures in order to correct what was going askew in the past. There were huge doubts on that. But a few weeks afterwards, there was 110 billion euros worth planned, or in a plan, and Greece corrected its GDP by 10% in order to meet the criteria. I mean, that happened. We set up also a potential plan for saving problem countries. 750 billion worth. 500 of that, more or less, came from European countries. People wouldn't have believed that that was possible, but it happened. And some said, well, Mediterranean countries have a different sort of culture. They're just not able to take the measures for genuine reform, and it's a waste of time, basically. And when I see what's being done in these countries, and under what circumstances, and what pain it has caused, and some people were happy to see this happening, but when I see what has happened, there has been a radical change, I'd say that, a sea change. And when I hear criticisms with respect to climate change, the European Union has the most ambitious programme in the whole world. We have even given our 2020 programme a legal base. We are the envy of the world. And when I hear criticism, therefore, the impression is given that we're doing nothing. That's totally wrong. And I find that difficult to stomach. I'm not saying that we should be sort of gawping optimists. But what is a problem is each achievement is reckoned to be too little, too late, and irrelevant. No. I'm happy to see the positive effects of our action, because that is the reality. When people talk about better governance, okay, of course. The euro has helped us actually a lot through the financial crisis. I could not for one moment entertain the idea of what the consequences of the financial crisis might have been had we not had this single currency of covering 350 million people. I just couldn't entertain what would have happened. What would have happened by way of instability? Monetary instability, had there not been the euro. We'd have been back to the 30s, straight back to the 30s, with a race to the bottom, with a sort of beggar my neighbour policy all round. We didn't get that, thanks to the currency stability of the euro. Obviously there were problems. There were disagreements and divergences within the euro area. I wasn't there in the first 10 years of the last century. I mean, who was in this hemicycle? And maybe we should pay more attention in this hemicycle and all sorts of other services. What actually helped us in the balance of payments problems and competitiveness problems? Actually, we didn't manage to do much then. We've changed our approach now, and this is a collective responsibility, and things are now being done to make sure that the euro is a stable currency. We've got to make sure that economic policies are more convergent, and we stop this divergence when it comes to our policies for development and the sort of politics we carry out. I still believe, ladies and gentlemen, that there are many other arguments which we could deploy. You could say, well, we need sanctions, but governments aren't... the first thing they worry about is not the fear of sanctions. But since we're talking about sanctions, in the task force, we've looked at coming up with real sanctions, not just so-called corrective sanctions for those who go beyond the 3% deficit rate, but also preventive sanctions, if you will, so that people who are below the 3% rate but not respecting the long-term plan and whose total debt is too high and who are not going in the direction or are not going in the right rate, then we can call them to book. And to the extent that the treaties allow us to, we can bring in sanctions which actually go beyond the Stability and Growth Pact which we have at the moment. We can bring them in preventively and reinforce them correctively. We're not going to come in with any sanctions which have no treaty basis. You can't do that. It's not possible. We should have thought about it back then. But when we have balance of payments and differences in competitiveness, you have to act. And this is the very first time. This is totally new. Nothing has been done at all so far. So with this task force, we've managed to make progress thanks to the ideas and the initiatives and the proposals from the Commission. And, well, we'll get them completely in a couple of weeks' time in this crucial area of competitiveness. So it's a new laboratory. I'm against this inverse skepticism that when you have programs, when you have results, when you have good intent, they are demolished in advance. You don't wait to see what's going to happen. We've made progress step by step with all institutions on governance. It is gradual, but I'm sure we'll get to our goal. I'm certain of that. When it comes to financial monitoring and surveillance, of course we're looking at that in the European Council. Obviously we discussed that with finance ministers. And in the European Parliament we can discuss that as well. It's not a sin to discuss it. I mean, why not? It's not really with an ulterior motive to wrap anybody's knuckles and preach to them. I won't give you a cartoon version of what the Council is doing. It's only coordination, and under that sort of general heading you can talk about any old thing. No, that would be a cartoon version, and I won't give you that. In this crucial area, it exists throughout finance, but in this crucial area we're going to have to work together. That is the Council, not really just the European Council, but the Council in general and the Parliament, to make sure that the 1st of January our new institutions can be up and running and working. We really do need them. And when it comes to finance, there too Europe is really a world leader. Would people applaud if all the countries who are in G20 talking about those who are members of the Union and President Barroso come up with the idea of a bank tax. Do you think they're going to be popular? Are they going to applaud us? No. But despite that, we're pioneers. We're the first. We talk about tax on financial transactions. Do you think we'll be applauded? No. But nevertheless, we put it forward. We're pioneers. And when it comes to ecology, finance, and all sorts of other sectors, we are doing precisely that. We're taking courageous initiatives. And we will defend them at the world level in certain areas, such as bank levies. And we've said that here. If there's no agreement worldwide, we will nevertheless act in Europe. And some member states are already undertaking initiatives that way, and I'm proud and happy. From the time when I was Prime Minister, we were pretty much the only country in Europe to take the initiative on taxing bank institutions. So I've listened to all this. I've listened very carefully to what everybody has to say, but I would respond in saying I have a positive approach. Some of you are saying, OK, we've got to be more positive and very critical of us. I don't mind that sort of criticism. But in any case, I'd like to stress that what we've managed to do was done in extremely difficult circumstance. The 3 or 4 first months of this year were very tough, but we'll nevertheless soldier on. And I'm sure some people who criticize me at the moment will support us, and maybe some won't applaud us, but nevertheless we're pressing ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Barroso.
Thank you. Regarding the specific question that was put to me in terms of financial supervision package, this financial supervision is indeed a flagship of the European reform, because the whole set of new arrangements depends on the new architecture. For instance, we have proposed that the credit rating agencies can be under the oversight of one of those new institutions. That is why it is so important to come to an agreement on this supervisory architecture that the Commission has put forward as a proposal after the report I've asked the high-level group chaired by Monsieur de Larosière to present to us. I would like once again to thank the European Parliament for being very supportive and for your ambition. This has helped us to make sure that the Council moves from its December position on some key points, some points that have been considered very important by the European Parliament. But now everyone needs to compromise. And this is the important question to address in the European Union. Because if we stay always at a position of considering that the others are not doing enough, we will not move forward. We need a compromise. And I believe that if a deal can be done, which in many areas will follow the European Parliament concerns, for instance, on key issues like product and certain transaction bans to protect consumers, dispute resolution powers for the authorities that include addressing direct decisions to financial companies. This will be a big move for the Council. The Commission supports that. And principles on resolution of crisis and deposit guarantee schemes, and a very comprehensive and strong review clause. I think there is a window of opportunity to close the deal in coming days. Tomorrow there will be a trilogue that is in fact very important. Things will not get easier if there is delay. Most likely some of those that are putting reservations will entrench and become even more difficult. But I think that it is not in the interest of anyone that wants a real European architecture to postpone it, not only because a full second reading, let's put it frankly, will make it almost impossible to have the new authorities running already from the 1st of January 2011. And so the idea, that's why urgency here is so important, is to have the new system with the new European 2020 strategy, with the new, if possible, economic governance, and also, hopefully, with a lot already done in terms of financial service regulation supervision, to have the new system to start 2011. That's why I'd like to ask you, as I've asked, of course, President of the European Parliament, listen to me, because it was immediately after his very interesting contribution to the European Parliament. I've asked also the Member States. I once again will ask this European Parliament, in the spirit of compromise, to make an effort to reach it. Of course, the Commission, the Commission has made a proposal, so we will be very happy with our proposal. But The community method is also about compromise. The community method is not just about stating the positions. It's also at the end about compromise. So that's why the Commission, bien sûr, and that's why the Commission is urging the Council to move. We have tabled an informal full compromise text today. We have tabled a text compromise today, and will continue to put friendly, constructive pressure on all the parties to come to an agreement. Okay.
Thank you very much. Now we have speakers for individual speakers. Mr. Karas, for 2 minutes.
Mr. Van Rompuy, today we're not looking back over the last few months. Let's keep a sense of proportion here. We're trying to assess the Council meeting. So I think that we should engage in self-criticism about our weaknesses. That's the kind of thing I would have expected. How are we going to cope with the kind of thing that's going on at the moment? The tangible results of the summit do not correspond to what we heard about in Strasbourg. Because here we need to look at the realities. What I expect from the Council is not leadership. I expect the Commission to show leadership in all issues. What I expect from the Council is that it shouldn't hesitate, it shouldn't block, and it should try to support the Commission. So really, I don't really think much of this new method of sending letters. These are all displacement activities. We get letters 24 hours before the summit from Angela Merkel or Mr. Sarkozy. Now we're getting letters from Mr. Van Rompuy, and we get a letter from President Obama, we get a letter from Canada. We want dates and projects. We don't want letters. Write fewer letters. Try to translate initiatives into tangible efforts and dates. Now here we need to look at a tangible programme for jobs and growth. I mean, here we haven't got a project vis-à-vis G20. The transaction tax has been floated, but there isn't a European project. We're seeing the supervisory body being blocked in trilogue, and we're seeing that problem recurring elsewhere on a whole series of issues. And in Basel at the moment, yes, I am winding up, President, the EU member states are meeting and they're actually looking at a definition of capital, and what we have to do is to try to make the announcements a reality.
1 minute 30.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, President. President of the Commission, President of the Council. Fortunately, the 2020 strategy has kept the goal of cutting poverty. We are concerned that the budgetary consolidation strategy in various places goes far too far and can undermine the basis of our struggle to reduce poverty by absorbing the key element of public financing. Now, when we're talking about economic governance, we're not just trying to criticise everything you do in the European Council, President. Rather, we want a fruitful debate. And as part of that fruitful debate, we have 2 or 3 significant proposals to put to you. First of all, as you said, macroeconomic issues and imbalances are very significant now. My great apprehension, the great apprehension of my group, is that the coming debate is hammering home the need to strengthen the implementation of the Growth and Stability Pact. That will satisfy some people. But what about the method of reducing the differences which are currently undermining the solidity of the Eurozone, which has led Citigroup to claim that the Eurogroup can no longer be seen as a whole? The second point that's essential as far as we're concerned is the penalty system, the sanctions. You're saying not just sanction those already in deficit, perhaps you need to think about smart sanctions, intelligent sanctions. Let's imagine you have a country in difficulty being asked to increase certain taxes. Then the extra revenue from those taxes could be paid to the European Union. So there are other methods than suspending countries' voting rights, for example.
Madame Sylvie GOULARD, 1 minute 30.
Merci, Messieurs les Présidents.
Thank you, Presidents. You've all heard this statement from the President of BP, made your hair stand on end. I wanted to get my life back. But there are governments who wanted to act as if there were no crisis and wanted their life back. Wanted to keep the sort of supervision of the past. As if not much had happened, so you could water down de la Rosière, as picked up by the Commission. You could refuse what the European Parliament is asking for, because basically it's only a mini-crisis. Let's get our life back when we don't need to do more. But that's not what we think in the European Parliament. Everybody has to shoulder their responsibilities properly. In December 2009, ECOFIN voted unanimously on a position which blocked all possibility of co-decision. The coordinators of the 4 groups of ECON, or in ECON, said you just can't make it work that way. And then on the 10th of May, they came back with a more stringent provision. So that's our position. We don't want a position of let's get back to where we were before. We want institutions which work now, community functioning bodies, where we decide together on common rules which are applicable to financial services and establishments. A system which is not based just on the goodwill of member states, and above all does not give right to veto to member states who quite patently don't want any financial supervision. We're happy to compromise, but not compromise ourselves with people who don't want to get to any sort of result.
Colleague Edvard KOŽUŠNÍK, 1 minute.
President of the Council, President of the Commission, I'm a member of the IMCO committee, which is responsible for consumer protection. We invited a couple of times Mr. Monti, and he prepared a Monti report. This report, in my view, was extremely sexy, but I had certain doubts about our boldness, boldness of European leaders and leaders at the national level to offer these sexy ideas and really implement them. Perhaps indirectly, I would like to ask you, there were rumors that both in the Council and the Commission you intend to introduce a super euro and worse euro. I'm really against such an idea, because we have experience with the Eastern and Western mark which functioned during the Cold War period.
Kolega Miguel PORTAS, minuta 30.
Mr. Portas.
Thank you, President. First of all, on the rates applying to banks and financial transactions, I must say I would have preferred less to be said about the financial transaction taxes and more capacity to take action being demonstrated. Look at the G20. We're going to be pioneers without any real impact. Now, on economic policy, how is it possible for the Council to say that it wants to cut poverty in Europe while at the same time on every side, in all the national budgets, what you're finding are policies involving drastic cuts of social spending? That's the real problem. How can we sustain the need for sustainable growth if in the meantime all the national policies are geared towards one sole goal, namely cutting wages and increasing the unfairest taxes, particularly VAT. That's why we have a problem with the Council. Because the Council is like the Vatican, which made life difficult for José Saramago in Portugal. So one last question. This obsession with national budgets and the idea that the Commission would have to give them the green light before they went ahead. Mr. Van Rompuy used an expression of preventive sanctions in dealing with national budgetary policy. What on earth is this? What's this all about? This is quite unacceptable. It's like having people blowing their vuvuzelas.
Ďakujem za slovo, vážený pán predseda, pán Rompuy, vážený pán predseda Barroso. V úvode
President, Mr. Barroso in the introduction talked about point 11 of the conclusions, strengthening preventive instruments in getting to the goals of the Stability Pact. After this was announced, there was a discussion which was started on participating countries and what they had to do to fulfill these provisions. So we've got to see how we can bring in everybody and help countries who have most problems. And who's got to have some sort of key about who's going to participate and how much in the bank. If we just keep to the stability mechanism as we have at the moment, the poor are going to get poorer and more indebted and be dependent on a transfer from the rich countries.
Mr. President, the EU's strategy for jobs sounds good, but the reality behind the scenes is very different. To take just one shocking example, the forthcoming trade agreement between the EU and India will have a devastating impact on Indian agriculture and pharmaceuticals. Indians are rightly worried by this threat to their prosperity and independence. But with the Indians giving up so much, we need to ask, what's in it for Indian big business? And what is it going to cost workers in Britain and Europe? The answer is Mode 4 immigration, which bypasses any national caps on immigration. Transnational corporations will gain the automatic right to bring in Indian labour to replace, for example, skilled British workers in steel and car plants and all the other industries now owned by Indian-based TNCs. The Indian-EU trade agreement will devastate the wages and employment prospects of hundreds of thousands of British and European workers. This is not a strategy for jobs, but a naked sellout to corporate greed. Thank you.
Thank you. Colleague José Manuel GARCÍA-MARGALLO, MARFIL. 2 minutes.
Señor Presidente,
Thank you, President. On financial supervision, the only real palpable measures, this notion of economic governance, which is somewhat ephemeral. We seem to be generating any amount of confusion here. This morning, the representative of the rotating presidency said that an agreement was close. But this is being economical with the truth. We're not close to an agreement, nor is it up to the presidency of the Council to tell us how we have to move. It's the Council that has to move, and I'll explain how. The Council agreement is on the barest minimum. The only competence at European level would be technical rules for harmonisation on interpreting European legislation. You don't need 4 sets for that. Article 290 in the treaty would have been enough for that. The Commission could have worked with the existing Committee of Banking Supervisors. What Parliament has said is that pan-European banks need to be supervised by a real European authority, a strong one subject to the scrutiny of this House. Secondly, those banks whose bankruptcy might damage us all have to be subject to special vigilance. Thirdly, when one of those banks encounters difficulties, the banking authority must have a range of instruments available to prevent this having a knock-on effect, reordering the bank's affairs without taxpayers bearing the brunt. And fourthly, we need 2 pre-funded funds from the sector respecting the polluter pays principle so that we don't all have to pay for the irrational pride of certain individuals. On Monday, Mr. Barroso was talking to a senior representative of the President.
Thank you. Time is over for Council. Michael Cashman, 1:30, please.
Thank you, President. President Barroso, President Van Rompuy. I have 90 seconds, and it's not a great deal of time, but I want you and the House to reflect on this. I speak as the rapporteur on the mid-term review of the Millennium Development Goals. The United Nations estimates that in 90 seconds, by the time I sit down, 45 people will have died in the developing world. 1 death every 2 seconds. Deaths from preventable diseases, malnutrition, from complications giving birth, from HIV and AIDS-related illnesses, from TB, from malaria. Every 1 second, every death, every 2 seconds. That is why we must meet our Millennium Development Goal commitments of the G20, as well as leading at the UN. And that is why we must keep our commitment, President, to continue funding those vital projects in the developing countries. I have 20 seconds left, and I would ask your indulgence in the House that we say no more until my time is up, but reflect on those 45 deaths that will have occurred in these 90 seconds.
Thank you, colleague. Madam Sharon Bowles, 1 minute 30, please.
Thank you, Mr. President. President Van Rompuy, I'm pleased to see you here, and as chair of the Econ Committee, I must say I'd rather like to see more of you in committee in your task force role, because when you come up with ideas, any multilateral surveillance will come to us under co-decision, and the longer that we are out of the loop, the longer it's going to take us to understand and agree the decisions you make. And we have some ideas too. Turning to the Council conclusions, I note that they urge rapid action on the supervision package, on AIFM and on derivatives. They do not give prominence to the Capital Requirements Directive, CRD3, which puts capital on the trading book. Now, trading book capital was shirked under pressure from banks from before the crisis, and it's what made speculative proprietary trading attractive and cost-free, an activity that was fundamental to the crisis. CRD3 would automatically shrink casino banking without having to sort out bans and splits. So why is it not top billing for early action and implementation? Finally, I appreciate the decision to apply bank stress tests and make them public. This is at least a year overdue and might have saved some of the current sovereign debt problem if it had been done sooner. But it's essential now that the stress tests applied cover all the challenges and concerns of the market. Otherwise, that would actually make matters worse. Thank you.
Madam Niki TZAVELA, 1 minute.
Thank you, President. President of the Council, I'm honoured to see you here, together with the other presidents. We met one another in Strasbourg. Anyway, your calm, tranquil approach is something I've greatly appreciated at this time of crisis. At the last summit, Germany agreed that the Union needed some form of economic governance. However, it refused to accept France's proposal. Governance, in other words, would have been delivered by the 16 members of the Eurozone. That was the initial proposal. Then we moved towards economic governance by the 27. So may I ask you, what sort of economic policy can be applied by 27 economies with 18 different currencies and 8 different currencies and different interest rates. Of course, I'm concerned about the Eurozone.
A few very brief words about Europe 2020, but points of fundamental significance. We can talk about progress when work leads to more growth which is linked to sustainability, but what we shouldn't forget is that we don't resolve the underlying problem. The fundamental issue here is how we can get away from this need to always have growth. I mean, asking this question as to what we can do about this, we need to start looking at a fundamental reform of the financial system. Then we have to start asking other questions about whether member states should be in charge of their own money, and here we're talking about some kind of cash reserve in banks, but I mean only states can answer such questions. Thank you.
Thank you, President. Fiscal and financial reforms, pivotal as they are not a substitute for structural change and competitive growth policies. That is why I would like to address first briefly the role of cohesion policy in the delivery mechanism of the EU 2020. In its conclusions, the Council sent us a clear message to involve cohesion policy in the implementation of the EU 2020. After all, this is a policy that was the only truly successful strand in the delivery of the Lisbon strategy, as confirmed by the recent March communication of the European Commission. Why? Because it sets binding guidelines that are conditions for Europe's resources to be transferred to a member state, a region or a city. It also leaves space for member states and regions to translate common European objectives into their own reality. It has an efficient machinery to monitor and support in achieving goals, and last but not least, it has also an efficient sanction mechanism. On economic governance, I would like to support strongly the idea of going beyond the fiscal surveillance towards competitiveness-related factors generating or contributing to imbalances. And I also believe we should say today clearly, urgently and loudly why fiscal surveillance did not work and Stability and Growth Pact did not deliver. If we continue to rely exclusively on decentralised fiscal discipline, maybe it will give us a better European governance, but it will not give us a good European governance. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam. Monsieur Ramon Jauregui Atondo, 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. Mr. Van Rompuy, Mr. Barroso. I agree with you on one point which I think is necessary for us to state, that is, in the meeting of last Thursday, the European Council then took decisions which were very important. Decisions which were unthinkable just 4 months ago. So we have to be courageous and state that squarely. Crises move Europe. That's a historical constant. And this one too, as you said, is a very important, serious crisis. And in the face of that, decisions were taken. Paths were explored. Some of them are decisive for Europe. And some of the decisions which were taken in the European Council, they've been mentioned, but as important is the need to review the treaty and call an intergovernmental conference to reform Protocol 36 of Lisbon. And quite rightly, that means, ladies and gentlemen, that we're looking to bring in 18 new members into this chamber, and 12 member states are going to have the right to a more fair representation than the one we currently have. Okay, fine. That being so, I think I have to make the significance of the Council having taken a decision to widen the number, increase the number of representatives in this Parliament. And today, if I'm correctly informed, the IGC has already taken a decision for the 27. And I agree. Congratulations, Mr. Rompuy, for that decision. Because I really think they should favour the ratification by 27 member states of this decision, giving this Parliament a better regulated level of representation and giving 18 member states or 18 new members the right to represent.
Cristian Dan PREDA, 2 minutes.
Thank you, President. Mr. Van Rompuy, Mr. Barroso, first and foremost, I welcome the decision of the European Council last week to initiate negotiations with Iceland. Today, in the External Affairs Committee in Parliament, my report on Iceland's accession to the EU was voted with a large majority, and in this report my colleagues said that they agreed to the accession of this country to the EU. But we should find a common solution in sectors such as fishing or agriculture. We strongly believe that Iceland can reach its objectives. It has already reached certain objectives, and it can incorporate the communitary acquis, and it can become a new member of the European family. Iceland can significantly contribute to the EU. It has a democratic tradition, it has experience in the protection of environment, and it can apply European policies in the Arctic area. Iceland will of course have things to gain after the accession, and we're not only speaking of economic stability, we're speaking of a greater influence at an international level, or a greater influence in what concerns decisions related to the internal market. On the other hand, we know that this people's opinion in what concerns the accession to the EU is extremely divided. We think that a public debate initiated by the government of this country, and supported, if the case should be, by the Commission, can lead to a useful debate, to the pros and cons related to this accession, and can lead to an informed choice of the Icelandic people. At the end of the accession process, Iceland will organize a referendum so as to see whether its people can support the result of this debate between the EU and Iceland. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, 130.
Thank you, President. There are differences between the economies in the north and south of Europe since the inception of the euro. The main reason is that the service sector in the south is more to do with agriculture and tourism, whereas you have heavy industry in the north. And so in the south, a number of reforms have begun, but they were driven by consumption, whereas in the north you had the development of cheaper methods. Now, what you see is that governance is the key to the whole issue. We need to turn that key, though, because some countries currently enjoy budget advantages and others are disadvantaged. If the South is to break out of this vicious circle, of course action will have to be taken at various levels. We need to increase exports of goods and services, and we need Eurobonds. Of course, that implies that the measures should not be adopted in such a way as would lead to unfair competition amongst countries. Steps are being taken in line with the individual circumstances of each member state at the moment. That's not desirable. What we need instead of that is a range of measures which will seek to moderate deficits and surpluses.
Thank you, President. In the Economic and Social Committee, Mr. Van Rompuy gave a good image of himself, and we really got a good basis for him. An ECOFIN, which was presided over recently, gave rise to some good results in some countries, one of which I know quite well, my own. The question is, where do we go now? Basically, what we should be doing is setting up some sort of safeguard idea or lifeboat beforehand. You're talking about supervision now of the national budgets. Okay, maybe we have to do that. But you said that the Commission supervising national budgets cannot be done before it's put to the various parliamentary chambers. But I think it's a good idea. You should explore that. You said, be brave. Well, that's de l'audace, toujours de l'audace. Be brave, be more brave, and be ever more brave. Because we are under the European Union protectorate. I prefer to be under that. And rather than people who just govern or come up with governance off the cuff. A genuine European level governance is better. And for some people say that if we're in the euro, it doesn't really matter because you're in the euro. But what happens to currencies which are, or be European, are not in the euro? I mean, if everything affects everybody. No man is an island. I know in crisis times to talk about fighting poverty is more difficult because there's less leverage. But what marks out great Europeans is to have social solidarity in fighting poverty. 2010 is the year of the fight against poverty. And that is not just one of the extra conclusions, the blah blah, which comes out of a European Council. It's got to be made into deeds. Thank you.
Madam Catherine Trautmann, 130.
Messieurs les Présidents.
Presidents, you told us a little while ago that Europeans must be firmly united as we head to the G20 summit, and the credibility of the European Union on the international stage is at stake. Well, first and foremost comes the Union's credibility in the eyes of its citizens, which is why it must equip itself with credible instruments to take us out of the crisis. I was looking to the European Council on the 17th of June to deal with the Union's budgetary discipline on the same footing with macroeconomic supervision and supervision of financial services, and it has to be said that that didn't happen. My second point, after this clear lack of internal solidarity, it's incumbent upon the European Union to take the leading role to get out of this. Economic and monetary union is badly designed. Let's be honest enough to say that. It's built in an imbalance between economic and monetary elements. Although we have 27% of world central bank reserves, the Union and the Eurogroup must coordinate national economic policies. The euro should not be the symbol of high prices for citizens. So as we look forward from this stage, we can't just reassure the markets, we need to reassure our citizens that we are going to find a way out of the crisis together. Thirdly, stepping up budget discipline at this time of crisis should not make the recession even worse. We want some evidence that the 2020 strategy will actually be flanked by adequate financial resources to allow us to develop the economy and guide it towards jobs and fruitful, solid investment. President, people are warning us with anger and coming fear. We don't want the Union to be the symbol of brutal austerity.
Delvaux, 2 minutes.
Monsieur le Président du Conseil.
President of the Council, very often we say needs must when it comes to law-making. But really I think we've got to be creative, show imagination, innovative. And what we've got from the Council is an agreement on a step forward, which I hope will be a giant step forward. We do have economic divergence, but simple coordination will not be enough. Can we get to a genuine budgetary federation, not forced by circumstance, but because we ourselves, our own free will, decide on that? We'll have to see. Talking about reinforcing the preventive side of the Stability and Growth Pact, that's a good thing, but there's no budgetary discipline without sanction for miscreants. Do we have that? No, and it's a pity. I'm happy to see on what you have decided upon by policies, the assessment of competitiveness as we go along. I mean, that's good because we have to renew competitiveness and have sustainable growth for everybody. Bank levy, tax on financial transactions, bank regulation. these are all decisions which were a few months ago or a few weeks ago illusory. Well, you might just say purely hypothetical. It's true. It's not really a profound cultural change. I mean, at the moment we're going forward by small steps, or so far, but in October, member states will specifically and tangibly have to make real these policies. That will make the distinction between whether it actually was a giant step forward or whether it was just a few pious words. Let's hope that we can, on the basis of majority, bring the citizens into this.
Thank you, Madam. Monsieur Gianluca Susta, 1 minute 30.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. President of the Council, as I'm the last to speak, or amongst the last to speak, let me give you some reassurance. I think you did a very good job in reminding us here that you represent Europe, not the governments. You represent the European Union as such. Now, that assertion may seem to be self-explanatory, but in practice it's not. And so I would urge you to stress your role so that the stable presidency of the Union can provide the necessary stimulus to the governments to make sure they move from words to facts. We had appreciation of what's been accomplished by the task force, or the idea of the task force in recent months. Also the fact that the heads of state and government have been forced to draft a significant document, because the contents of the document, President, if they are actually translated into practice, are well and good, but we're not sure that all the member states want to put them into practice. They are significant anyway. We wonder whether in the final document what is said about financial transaction taxes, that will actually be followed in practice. We'll see what the task force does to make sure that we have effective tools for economic governance geared towards growth. We want to make sure that this is part and parcel of the policy thrust. There's an innovation here, and we do hope that the permanent President of the Union will use his best endeavours to ensure these do become a reality.
Mr. Gunnar HÖKMARK, 2 minutes.
Very much, and thanks for the report here today. I think we can all welcome the conclusions and the goals set by the European Council. I have 3 points that I would like to comment on. The first one is about the euro. I think if we are achieving those things that are set up with, I would like to underline, foreseeable and automatic sanctions for them who are not following the rules, then we will have a much stronger framework that maybe we will see the rebirth of the euro with a much stronger framework than we have ever had before. That will be a contribution to the future of European economy. But that implies also that we need to do a lot of things regarding growth. I welcome the clear goals set here, but I would like to remind us all that the hard work and the difficult choices are to be made. And they are not made by just setting the goals. We have learned that from the Lisbon process. We need to be able to make the courageous decisions, opening up for more trade, more investments, more innovations. And that is needed to be done, because otherwise we have only bought ourselves time, and then all the problems will come back again. And finally, we are now entering a phase of global economy which will be characterized by the reduction of deficits. It will be so in the US and it will be so in Europe. And we all know the risks with this contraction of economic development. We need to secure that we can stimulate the economy parallel to that. And in that sense, I think what is written in the conclusions about the Doha round should be strengthened. And I think it should be strengthened in a way to make it consistent. I can't understand a financial transaction tax which will hinder trade and liquidity and will damage more for poor countries and countries with big deficits. We need to support and stimulate trade. By that we can get the injection, Mr. Speaker, that can make the world better. Thank you.
Thank you very much. 1 minute, colleague Paweł ZALEWSKI.
Thank you very much, President of the Commission and the Council. The crisis has shown us that we are still not united and integrated enough. Despite the Lisbon Treaty, we don't have proper economic governance yet. We should stand up and be counted. We should be united. And we had this domino effect. We had crisis in one country and a spillover effect. I welcome the conclusions of the European Council. I think there is a dire need for economic coordination. There should be sanctions for those countries that break the rules. And I'm also happy to see that we have not created an exclusive club for the Euro Plus members. We should remember that euro is a currency for those who are already in, but also open to those who want to join in the future. And I think it is very important to leave the door open for those countries that will join in the future, and they should also take part in the decision-making process.
Pani Jutta Steinruck.
Mrs. Jutta Steinruck.
Verehrte Präsidenten,
Presidents, I think it's a good thing, and indeed very important, that we're all undertaking efforts to stimulate growth and jobs, and we're trying to tackle the root causes of the crisis. But we have to learn from past mistakes to avoid repetitions, and there's one thing I think is particularly important, and we should never lose sight of it, and that is combating poverty. I think it's a pity that heads of European governments were not willing to pick up on, in a committed fashion, the Commission's proposal to combat poverty. Now, last week's Council meeting was one at which the original aims were watered down. And here, reduction of the number of people who live in poverty by 20 million is not enough. We've seen a lack of will, and really we would have preferred it if the 25% reduction of the number of people living in poverty, which was the Commission's ambition, could have been espoused, because poverty is a danger to Europe.
Madam, third person in KARCÍA, Madam Isabelle Durant.
President, obviously, I want to speak to Mr. Van Rompuy, who's just gone, unfortunately. But nevertheless, let me put down a marker for him and for everybody that if we don't want to make cartoons of ourselves, we've got to remember some of us are his best allies when it comes to coordination strategy and budgetary control. That should be remembered. And I talk to you now, Mr. Barroso. Perhaps you should note a proposal put in the Budgets Committee that in the task force maybe we could air the idea of a convention, a new one on budgetary aspects, so we could look at how member states will all be brought under rules of budgetary stringency, so they can work in a monitoring way, but look at dividing labour on monitoring national expenditure. This brings in community institutions for monitoring and sanctions. Everybody's got to be involved.
Colleague Oreste Rossi, 1 minute.
Onorevole Presidente, onorevoli colleghi, ho ascoltato.
President, colleagues, I've listened carefully to what the President of the Council and the President of the Commission had to tell us. Both of them said they wanted to cooperate with Parliament to meet the challenges of the future and economic governance and the 2020 strategy. And it's positive to see that the task force agreed on in September is moving towards real proposals. We have to look at international developments on the nuclear front. Well, there are various goals here that we can all sign up to. But Europe is in a crisis. We've lost millions of jobs, and no improvement is yet on the horizon. We're talking about 8.5 million new jobs being created in the 2020 strategy, but most of these will be for extremely highly qualified people, and there's virtually nothing for unskilled workers. So the challenge here in preparing the new generation for a new Europe.
Mr. Mario Mauro.
Grazie, Presidente.
Thank you, President. the President of the Council, Mr. Van Rompuy, deployed an expression in his statement. Gradually, I think, was the word. Perhaps better than any other expression, shows how laborious the whole thing. Gradually means that degrees or grades of goodwill in member states are not always the same. And it means to say the statements of good intent coming out of the Council have to be amplified upon. We've got to go from gradually to soon and done well. I think this is something the Commission should bear in mind, because leadership at the moment, political leadership of this Europe of ours, which is proposed and is trying to come up with initiatives, has to be under our institutional architecture at the moment. It should be the Commission President. It's got to be the locomotive force. Make proposals so that we can conclude and show the ability to innovate.
Mr. President, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Just in the
First of
proper
all,
moment.
some of the persons who put me the question are no longer there. So anyway, I will try to respond to them. First of all, regarding the role of the European Parliament in the Europe 2020 strategy, that has been a concern of many of you, namely Corien WORTMANN-KOOL. She has been a very important leader in this Parliament regarding the rights of the Parliament in establishing this strategy. I think indeed the European Parliament has a key role to play. It is our common responsibility to be successful in exiting the crisis, returning to growth. It is on the delivery of structural reforms and on fiscal consolidation that our Member States must do much better than over the last decade. The European Parliament will first of all have to play a key role as co-legislator in adopting legislation put forward to implement the flagship initiatives. The Commission has recently adopted the first flagship initiative for a digital agenda. 6 more flagship initiatives will follow before the end of 2010. It's a very, let's say, intensive programme. These flagships will entail a set of legislative proposals, and the Commission is counting on European Parliament's support to deal with flagships and proposed legislation in a rapid and coherent fashion. I am looking for a commitment of the European Parliament to fast-track the adoption of those initiatives. Secondly, I believe the European Parliament should play a much more active role than under the Lisbon Strategy in defining and monitoring the Europe 2020 strategy. This calls for taking timely, proactive, common positions. The European Parliament could also play a role in mobilising national parliaments. But I think there is now room for shifting this dialogue away from general discussions on Europe 2020, the kind of general discussion that sometime I have been participating in the first phase, but now to move towards much more specific issues, such as the 5 core themes of the strategy: employment policies, R&D and innovation, energy efficiency, education and fighting poverty, and monitoring national performance. National parliaments must become key actors in monitoring their government's performance and commitments to the proper implementation of their national Europe 2020 strategies, targets and the European Union recommendations. This is a very important point. I know that some of you are not happy. I would also have preferred a higher level of ambition in terms of the monitoring of the strategy. But in fact there are considerable improvements, and I like to ask you not to underestimate the potential of these improvements. The fact that there will be now national reform programmes and specific national targets makes it possible to monitor in a concrete manner not only what is being done generally by Europe, but what each country is doing in all those matters. And this can be done also, and should be done, if I may express this opinion, by the European Parliament, with, of course, the other institutions. First, on this priority is, because of this year as well, poverty. And I like what some of you have said, namely Menendez de Vigo and others, regarding that we should take advantage of this year being the European Year of Fighting Poverty and Social Exclusion to launch some active policies. It was not easy to get that target agreed at European level. Some expressed doubts in terms of subsidiarity. At the end it was possible to get some kind of commitment, and so I think we should make that as a visible action already now, this year, because we have an emergency also in the social reality of Europe. Finally, coming back to the Europe 2020, as budgetary authority, the European Parliament will have to play its role in definition of next multiannual financial framework. Budget priorities must reflect Europe 2020 priorities. We will come with our budget review in September. I think that will be the moment to engage in a broad discussion about the future of our financial perspectives, namely some of the ideas that have been also suggested in the discussions, in the preliminary discussions with the Parliament. I want to pay tribute to the working paper of Alain Lamassoure that has been presented to the Budget Committee this week on how to finance Europe 2020 in times of crisis. And I believe the ideas that have been put forward, how can we decide on what could be spent at European level, at what can be spent at national level, is indeed something for the Parliament, working also with the other institutions. On behalf of the Commission, I want to tell you that we are committed to working with you in that area. Another point that was made, it was by Mr. Cashman, is no longer here, is on MDGs. I fully share everything he said on this, and the need to keep the momentum on that matter, specifically now where there are heavy constraints on the budgets of our member states. It will be difficult to be sure about their commitment. In fact, from that point of view, the conclusions of the Council are good, and in the letter, together with President Van Rompuy, I addressed to the G20 colleagues, we make a point about it. We are reaffirming, on behalf of the European Union, and taking into consideration the commitments made by our member states, that the European Union remains committed to support the achievement of the MDGs globally by 2015. And we believe that this is possible if all partners demonstrate firm political commitment. So that's a point that we are going to bring to G20 and G8 outreach meetings this weekend in Canada. Some of you also asked about stress testing. I think it was a very positive announcement, a positive signal ahead of the G20 summit in Toronto, an important step to restore confidence in Europe's banks and Europe's economic prospects. The details of the commitment made at the European Council last week, including the exact scope of the exercise, are currently being discussed by all relevant stakeholders, in particular by the Committee of European Bank Supervisors, the respective national supervisors and also the respective ministers of finance. The ultimate decision on this issue will be taken in the next few days. We are, as Commission, playing an important part in this process. We need to advocate an approach that would ensure to have the sample as representative as possible, while taking into account the time frame set for the publication of the results, 2nd of July. There is a delicate balance to be struck. I also believe that the results should ideally also take into account the most recent developments in sovereign debt markets. The credibility of the exercise will be considerably enhanced if the exercise appropriately addresses the recent pressures in sovereign debt markets. I understand that the Committee of European Banking Supervisors has been reflecting on this issue, and that exercise is taking place with all concerned parties, including the Commission, while the ultimate decision in this regard will be taken in the next few days. Finally, some of you mentioned the issue of the Gulf leaks in terms of the oil leak. Just yesterday, I received the CEO of BP to be sure that they are taking all the measures and they are drawing all the lessons from that ecological catastrophe. And in fact, I think not only that company, but generally speaking, the industry have to draw the lessons. They gave me assurances that they are taking all the steps to ensure that their operations, particularly those in and around the European Union, are undertaken with the safety of citizens and the environment as a corporate priority. We are currently reviewing applicable EU legislation. In fact, we have been already working on this before this crisis. During some meetings with the Baltic states, when some of our partners, for instance Finland, raised the issue of the possible consequences in case there is a kind of ecological catastrophe of this kind in Baltic, what could be doing, we are already working on this. I believe that a hasty or premature regulatory response to events in the Gulf should be avoided. In fact, no regulatory regime can give a 100% guarantee of safety. Much depends on the attitude and practices of the industry itself. However, the Commission will not hesitate to propose changes in Europe if the current analysis, namely the investigation in the Gulf of Mexico, reveal weaknesses. We are intensifying our contacts and dialogues with national authorities and regulators. Furthermore, Commissioner Oettinger, in cooperation with Commissioners Georgieva and Potočnik, established contacts with the oil industry at a meeting in early May, and they are keeping that meeting this week. We have been also coordinating through the MIC assistance in response operations. Member States and the European Maritime Safety Agency have responded promptly. But this I was just giving as an example of initiatives that the Commission is taking. And coming now to the last point made by Mario Mauro, I want to reassure him and the Parliament that, of course, the Commission will take all its initiatives in the spirit of good cooperation with all the other institutions. Because, as I said before, and I said in another meeting, yes, indeed, the Commission is the economic government of Europe in the matters that have been transferred from the national member states, from our member states to the European Union. But of course, we need to work in cooperation with all the institutions. The European Council has also an extremely important role to play. That is in the treaty, and we are cooperating there. The President of the Commission is a member of the European Council, and the European Parliament, of course, as well. So I think it is in this spirit of partnership that we can indeed make our project go forward. And I really want to thank those members of the European Parliament that showed this extraordinary patience. This is the kind of resilience that we need for our economy as well. Thank you.
Thank you, President. Thank you, colleagues. I close the debate. I close the session. Next session in 12 days, 5th of July in Strasbourg. Thank you very much.